Dear English literature learners, I'd like to give you some idea on questions and answers on English literature, early English period, 450 to 1066, part C. This video is confined to broad questions with answers on the early English period, part C. Broad questions with answers on early English period, 450 to 1066. Question 1. What do you know about the beginning of Old English period or Anglo-Saxon period? Or trace the beginning of the historical background of Old English literature. Answer. England is an island nation of the northern coast of Europe. The cliffs at Dover were the first of Britain seen by early incomers and have become a familiar symbol of England. To quote Arnold, "The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. England is an island, and these cliffs are part of what the Romans from 2nd century had called Saxon shore, southeastern shores of Britain. The Romans left Britain in 410 after 4 centuries of occupation in the early 5th century. Later in that century, the Angles and Saxons took over the lion's share of the island of Britain. By 700, they occupied the parts of Great Britain which Roman had made part of empire. This part became known as England, the land of the Angles, and its language was English. Therefore, the Old English or Anglo-Saxon literature appears to be the origin of English literature. It seems that the manuscripts of this literature were composed by churchmen. The people eventually called the English were once separated people, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Jutes were invited in 449 to save British kingdom from the Saxons. English poetry proceeded, writing by some generations. The first poem in English were the songs that might have been heard from the boats crossing the narrow sea to the Saxon shore to conquer Britannia. The authorship of most of this literature is unknown. Only 1 or 2 names are known. The English poem composed by Caedmon and Bede are the earliest we know of. Their manuscripts were hard to read. Very little were read between Middle Ages and reign of Queen Victoria. When they were published, only then they could take their place in English literary history. Old English is now well understood, but it looks so different from the English of today that it cannot be read or made out by a well-educated reader in a way the writings of Shakespeare and Chaucer can. Therefore, Old English literature is a part of English literature. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes were illiterate. Their orally composed verses were not written unless they were formed in runic inscription. However, the English gradually learned to write after they had been converted to Christianity by missionaries sent from Rome in 597. Strictly, there is no Old English writing that is not Christian because the only literates were the churchmen. Question 2. What are the literary features of Old English period? Answer. Pagan origin. Old English literature has its origin in pagan. Many of the poems are associated with the pagan past, in particular with Seth or Beowulf. The earliest English poems or themes have also their origin in the continental home of the English people. As time went on, Christian idea influenced the earlier pagan, but the pagan phrases remain. Number 2, anonymous origin. Old English poets have a direct reference to some anonymous origin. For example, Caedmon and Cynewulf are two anonymous poets mentioned to have written poems. Number 3, imitative quality. Much of the prose and some of the poetry is translated or adopted from Latin. The favorite works for translation were the books of the Bible, the lives of saints, and various works of practical nature. Number 4, the manuscripts. It is certain that only a period of Old English poetry has survived. The manuscript in which poetry is preserved are late in date and are 4 in number. They are the Beowulf, the Junius, the Exeter Book, the Vercelli Book. In fact, Old English had oral origins and conventions, but it would be a mistake to think that oral poetry would be inartistic. The Germanic oral poetry survived at the end of Roman Empire. Oral poetry was an art which evolved over generation. It was an art of memorable speech. At times, it dealt with heroic and narrative themes. It seems that the first English poetry resembles Homeric poetry. As classic literature begins with Homer's epic, so does early English literature begin with Beowulf. The orally composed poetry of the Anglo-Saxon was an established art. Question 3. Write a note on Old English poetry with the reference to one significant work. Answer. Old English literature dates back to heroic age in the past when warriors were more heroic and kings were kings. The Christian heroism, the dream of Ruth, redirected the old pagan heroism, which can be seen in fragments of Germanic heroic poetry. The early poems like Waldir, Finnsburg, etc. are dramatic fragments which are also shown in Beowulf. These poems recall the time before the Angles came to Britain in 5th century. The minstrel poems like Widsith and Dure are also important. Widsith means far traveler who lists the name of tribes and their rulers. Dure is a scop who lost his position to console himself. Although English writing came with Christianity, not everything that was written was wholly Christian. For example, Caedmon converted the traditional praise of heroism performed by poets, such as Widsith and Dure, to spreading gospel. Gradually, Old English literature turned to be Christian literature. The New Testament is principally represented in translation. The translation of Bible into English did not begin in the 14th century or 16th century. The Gospel, Psalms, and other books were translated into English throughout the Old English period. Beowulf. Of the Old English period, Beowulf is most remarkable. Like Greek literature, English literature begins with an epic. It is a poem of historic scope, telling of heroism and of the world, human and non-human. Compared with the epics of Homer, Beowulf is short with 3,182 verses. Yet it is the longest and richest of Old English poems. Beowulf showed the English the world of their ancestors, the heroic world of the past. Dynasties like their identity from their ancestors, and the rulers of English kingdom ruled by night of ancestral conquest. The date and provenance of Beowulf are uncertain. Its author is unknown. The text of Beowulf is found in a manuscript in a West Saxon dialect of Wessex, which became the literary standard. All the texts are about monster. But the prime concern of Beowulf is not with the monster or even heroism, but with human wisdom and destiny. The story of Beowulf. There are many episodes and digressions in the story of Beowulf. It is impossible to give a brief synopsis of the narrative. In outline, it can be said that Beowulf, son of Eetiu, sails to Denmark with a band of warriors and rids the Danish king, Roger, of a terrible monster called Grendel. The mother of Grendel, seeking revenge for the death of her son, meets the same fate. Beowulf was rewarded and returned to his native land. He becomes the king of Geats, and after a prosperous reign of some 40 years, he kills a dragon which ravaged his land, but in the fight he received a mortal wound. The poem concludes with the funeral ceremony in honor of the dead hero. Question 4. Give an account of Old English Christian poetry, or write an essay on Anglo-Saxon religious poetry with reference to Caedmon and Cynewulf. Answer. The Anglo-Saxon literature or Old English literature can be broadly divided into two groups, pagan and Christian. The Anglo-Saxon settlers brought with them some poems which are of pagan origin. Later on, they were colored by Christian doctrine and morality. Thus, there was a blend of pagan and Christian sentiment in them. Among the pagan poems, the most prominent is Beowulf. There were other poems like Widsith, the fight of Finnivar, the battle of Maldon. There were some elegies like the Wanderer, Dior, the Seafarer, the Wife's Complaint, the Ruin, etc. This poem came from pagan tradition, but some of them had Christian sentiment. They presented a bleak and somber world. As a result, a sense of melancholia pervades all of these poems. Christianity produces two great poets, Caedmon and Cynewulf. They were the representative poets of English Christian poetry. The origin of early religious poems has been described by Bede in his Historia Ecclesiastica. He tells the story how his lady brother Caedmon became divinely inspired and wrote poetry. He glorified the creation, Exodus, the Passion of Christ, and many other biblical stories. The other Anglo-Saxon poets are known to us by name of Cynewulf. He was a writer of great influence and a poet of genuine power. His name survived many years even after his death. His important poems are Christ, Juliana, The Fate of Apostles, The Fall of Angels, The Dream of Ruth. Therefore, from the Anglo-Saxon poetry, it is not difficult to choose two great poems, Beowulf and The Dream of Ruth. Beowulf is written in the form of an epic. It is a story of heroic deeds. However, it also combines Christian elements. On the other hand, The Dream of Ruth is undoubtedly the first of Old English religious poems. It is a story of crucifixion told by the cross itself. In his dream, the poet sees the miraculous tree by turns shining in jewels and bathed in blood. It related to him the story of his life from the day when it was struck down on the verge of the forest to that on which the young hero was lifted onto it. The dreamer in this poem sees at midnight a glorious cross rise to fill the sky, worshipped by all creation. It is covered with gold and jewels, but at other times covered with blood. It is honored by men as beacon light and a cure for all ills of life. The poem has religious overtone. It is allegorical meaning. its allegorical meaning influenced the later medieval school of allegorical poetry. The poem also presents the warrior culture of the past. In warrior culture, it was the duty of a man to stand by his lord and die in his defense. But the lord in the dream is an Anglo-Saxon hero who wants to join battle with death. The cross is the uncomprehending but obedient participant in its Lord's death. The cross yields his Lord's body to his human followers who buried him. 3 crosses are also buried. In a devotional conclusion, the cross explains that it is now honored as a sign of salvation and commands the dreamer to tell man the Christian news of the second coming, when those who live under the sign of cross will be saved. Therefore, we can say the poem shows Old English riddle tradition, the story of crucifixion. In other words, it fills the living culture with theology and redirecting the heroic code of loyalty and sacrifice from the earthly to heavenly Lord. Question 5. Consider Beowulf as a storehouse of Teutonic culture, or Beowulf as a mirror of ancient Germanic life, or Beowulf as a record of Anglo-Saxon life and civilization. Answer. Hrothgar was the king of Danes. He built a great hall named Heorot for feasting and distributing gifts. But a monster disturbed by the sound of the feasting attacked the hall and killed the man sleeping there for long 12 years. Such acts of killing continued. No one dared to resist the monster. Beowulf, the nephew of Hygelac, who was the king of Geats, decides to come to rescue the kingdom of Hrothgar. He was greatly welcomed by the people of Danes. He has come to fight with Grendel, the monster. As usual, the man went to sleep, leaving Beowulf and his man in the hall. Grendel opened the door and killed Beowulf's man. Grendel caught hold of Beowulf, and Beowulf showed his great physical strength fighting with the monster. Beowulf was able to tear off a hand of Grendel. The monster fled off to the sea cave and died. The victory of Beowulf was celebrated. Grendel's mother became furious and rushed to the hall to kill Beowulf, but Beowulf was not there. She too was king's friend, Aesir, to the sea cave. Beowulf heard the mischief and went into the sea cave. He reached the den of Grendel's mother. A battle took place and Beowulf killed her. The Danes got rid of the monster. Later on, he became the king and ruled for 50 years. Even in his old age, he detracted a dragon. When he died, people lamented and cried loudly. The story of Beowulf presents a picture of Teutonic life and manners. It presents the activities of the forefathers of English in pre-Christian era. Therefore, Beowulf is considered as a criticism of Anglo-Saxon life. Beowulf is to the Anglo-Saxon as Iliad and Odyssey to the Greek. The following characteristics of German life we find in Beowulf. Anglo-Saxons were a pastoral race. They were hard-working people and lived by hunting. They were physically stout and was ready to face danger. There were feud and tribal fighters. The women enjoyed high position. They had rights and privileges. Men carried weapons, armors as a mark of heroism. Cowardice was contempt. Therefore, we can say Beowulf presents a faithful picture of German life and manners. Question 6. Consider Beowulf as an epic. Answer. Beowulf is the single greatest story of Old English literature and one of the greatest epics of all time. The creation of this poem was said to be alive around 600 AD, and the story was since then been passed down orally from generation to generation. To be considered as an epic, a piece of literature must exhibit quite a few specific literary techniques. Some of the main criteria include being a long narrative poem, having an epic hero, and containing rhythm, alliteration, and imagery. Beowulf can be considered an epic because it contains all of these criteria. Beowulf, first and foremost, is a long narrative poem. It contains 3,182 lines and has been divided into 43 sections. It has been written in a way that formulates a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience and arranges so that the language stimulates an emotional response, the basis of why a piece of writing would be considered a poem. Beowulf also contains an epic hero. The title of the poem has been named after our epic hero, Beowulf. In definition, an epic hero is someone that does deeds longer than life and is stronger and smarter than any normal man. And Beowulf fits this description, and if the mold were made for him, he has the strength of a 30 man and uses it as a major weapon against evil. This can be seen through Beowulf's battle with Grendel, Grendel's mother and the dragon. Beowulf's first accomplished as an epic hero was his battle with Grendel. Grendel was a huge beast, a descendant of Cain, who ruthlessly murdered innocent Danes because he felt pity for himself. Upon hearing of the Danes' problem, Beowulf set off to help the Danes without having been called upon. Even though Beowulf had man backing him, he drew battle with Grendel alone and without armor or weapons. Yet Beowulf emerged victorious with the arm of Grendel as his trophy. Beowulf then went on to kill Grendel's vengeful mother and a huge fire-breathing dragon who thought it had been done wrong by the Geats. The rhythm used in Beowulf was a tool used by many scopes in that era to help them remember all of the words of the epic and to set a contrast beat so that more could be easily added on to the story. The rhythm of an epic was best utilized when a musical instrument such as a small harp would accompany the scoop as he recited his tale. Imagery is the most important literary technique used in an epic. It is used to immerse the audience in the scene. The audience should feel every sense as if the actions were happening in real life. By using literary techniques outlined and explained in this paper, there is no reason for anyone to not believe that Beowulf is not an epic. Beowulf exemplifies the criteria for an epic beautifully and should be considered one of the greatest epic of all time. Question 7. Discuss the pagan and Christian element in Beowulf. The Anglo-Saxon literature before the advent of Christianity was pagan or secular. Beowulf bears testimony that it is the work of an England pagan poet, who was modified by a Christian monk, The heroic qualities of the pre-Christian Germanic culture are mingled with Anglo-Saxon Christianity. In other words, the pagan and Christian elements come together in Beowulf. Pagan elements abound in Beowulf. The dreadful aspects of nature and heroism of Beowulf points out the pagan aspects of the poem. Beowulf follows to find out Grendel's mother. Every night seems like fire in water. The wild natural description and heroic feats of Beowulf echo the heroic age of the pagan. Beowulf receives a pagan burial. The custom of Beowulf's cremations is pagan. His speeches were buried in his ashes were buried in a magnificent mound. There are references to heathen gods like the heaven, the earth, the father, the mother, etc., which link up Beowulf with Anglo-Saxon poetry. Moreover, the praise of worldly glory that we find in Beowulf is also pagan. Beowulf also contains fragments and allusions taken from pagan mythology. And the use of mythological stories give the poem a touch of paganism. There is no overt or covert reference to Christ or Christianity in Beowulf. Christian saints, holy relics, or Christian worship were absent and unthinkable in the poem of the early age. In fact, the poem was completely a pagan poem. In spite of the fact some Christian elements may be traced in Beowulf. For example, Heorot was visited by the monster Grendel. Religious songs were sung to get rid of the monster. Grendel appears as a devil from the hell. The prayers offered by the Danes to their gods are of no avail. They fail to worship the Lord of Heaven. The reference to the Lord of Heaven has some elements of Christianity. The Anglo-Saxons believed in gods and goddesses. But with the advent of Christianity, their faith was changed and they began to believe in the will of God. The faith in the will of God is Christian indeed. After Beowulf's victory over Grendel, Hrothgar prays like a true Christian. He wishes a good thing for Beowulf. In the encounter of Beowulf with the fire dragon, there is a reliance on God. It was believed that he who really relies on God in all occasions receives God's protection and can easily come out of the problems of life. There are some biblical references in Beowulf. The giants before the flood, or the Noah's deluge, and Satan are some of the biblical references in the poem. Beowulf is the hero of the poem. He embodies the characteristics of two cultures, primitive Germanic and the advent of Christian culture. He seems to believe the Christian idea of eternal bliss. He denounces all earthly rewards. He fought for his personal honor, but he was totally committed to service to his people. He saves them from the enemy of God. He offers thanks to the creation for his victory against the monster. Therefore, we can say pagan elements and Christian belief coexist in Beowulf. Question 8. Give an account of the writings of Anglo-Saxon prose, or assess the contribution of Alfric Wulfstan to Old English prose. Answer. There were a few prose writings before the time of Alfred, the king of Wessex. He was the pioneer among the Anglo-Saxon prose writers. As Chaucer is called the father of English poetry and Spenser the poet's poet, so is Alfred is recognized as the father of English prose. Literary prose did not begin until the 19th century, when Alfred attempted to bring back to his kingdom her lost learning. The miserable condition of English learning was largely the depredations of the Danes. Even the knowledge of Latin was declining, and the king attempted to educate the clergy so that they can translate the popular books like theology, history, philosophy, etc. into English. And these books are his contribution to English literature. In fact, he tried to revive learning. Sometimes he translated word for word, at times freely, but those passages have great value both for the understanding the character of the king and the literary quality of the prose of his prose works. His 5 important translations are the Pastoral Care of Pope Gregory, the History of the World of Orosius, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, Beatus consolation of philosophy. The soliloquies of St. Augustine, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, was inspired and organized by King Alfred. It is a record of this. It is the record of the deaths of the king, beginning of Caesar, and the translation of visions. It is the oldest document of English prose recording the history of England from the time of Roman occupation to the middle of the 12th century. In fact, after defeating the Danish king, Alfred tried to improve the lamentable state of England's English learning. He not only translated but also encouraged and rewarded learned men. He has become a patron of the scholar. His translation made great contribution to literature. In regard style, Alfred's prose style was highly Latinized. He gave English prose strength and dignity by introducing Latin elements into English prose. However, his prose style is not polished, but for the most part, it is simple and straightforward. He has shown his natural ability. Ælfric was probably the best known writer for his grammar. He was a churchman who has become the abbot of Benedictine monastery. He wrote musical prose. Among his work, the best important are the Catholic homilies, the lives of saints. These are the translation from the scriptures. His style is natural and easy, and it has poetic quality. Wulfstan was the Archbishop of York. Many of his signed homilies survived. His most famous work is Sermo, Lupiad Anglos. It is important for its strength and vigor, repetition of ideas, and illustrative nature of his style. Wulfstan teaches as a preacher, where Ælfric teaches as a teacher. Both of them use rhyme and alliteration in their work. It seems that Anglo-Saxon prose is more close to modern English than Anglo-Saxon poetry. Poetry was archaic and retained obsolete works, but prose was close to the speech in daily use, or it has models on Latin, which has become the universal language of educated Europe. When the revolution came in the form of Norman conquest of England, poetry suffered a lot. But prose, in spite of the changes during these 100 years of Norman conquest, remained recognized and suffered no break with the past. In other words, even during the Norman conquest in 1066, prose didn't show any sign of decay. Rather, it influenced the literature of Middle English period. Question 9. Give an account of treatment of nature in English literature, in English poetry. Nature has always been a significant issue in the study of English poetry. The emotional responses of the poets have always been reflected in their description of nature. The literature of Old English period bears testimony to the fact that Old English life was closely influenced by the natural phenomena. The hostility of the sea influenced the life of the Old English people. People struggled for their survival. Therefore, adoration of nature is reflected in the works of Old English literature. In other words, the tempest, the thunder, the vast sea, the setting sun, the landscape, etc. have been realistically portrayed in the works of Old English poetry. The bleak and sinister aspects of nature are apparent in Anglo-Saxon poetry. In Beowulf, the bleak and ugly aspect of nature is predominant. The sea that Beowulf crosses is stormy sea. Beowulf follows to find out Grendel's mother in the bottom of sea, which is death chill or fire in water. In Beowulf, we find a pessimistic, hard and realistic picture of nature. Man is helpless against the atrocity of nature. Beowulf alone gives us a hard and realistic picture of nature. In the poem Wanderer, we also find a gloomy description of nature. In the poem Husband's Message, the lover asks his wife to sail immediately in the spring when the cuckoo bird sings sorrowful song from the lofty cliff. In the poem Wife's Complaint, the wife laments for her isolation from the husband. The description of nature creates a background. The darkness of nature reflects the mood of the wife. Another poem, The Seafarer, portrays a vivid picture of the sea. The sailor watches the charming beauty of the sea. He also sees the wild and ravaged aspects of the sea. In fact, the early English poetry was silly Christian poetry. Christian religious love is also evident in their treatment of nature. In Old English poetry, we find the use of the moon, the honor of the sea, and their natural phenomenon. There we can say nature in her diverse aspect have been portrayed in Old English poetry. We can say that poetry adds an extra beauty to Old English poetry. Moreover, treatment of nature in Old English poetry seems to inspire the Romantic poets who romanticized nature and described natural beauty emotionally by throwing a coloring of imagination on the ordinary phenomenon of nature. Thank you for watching. I am Shamim Sarwar. My next video is on the broad questions and answers on Middle English period, part C. Have a nice day.